Hi, I'd like to say a few words about the just world fallacy. This is my first semester including this unit on the just world fallacy, and I decided to include it based on some observations that I've noticed recently. So last year, I was talking to my neighbor about this incident, the case of Caleb Schwab. I was talking over the fence with my neighbor, and he was taking his kid to a water park, and I said, well, just be careful. You heard about the kid. So apparently this kid, Caleb Schwab's family took him to a water park in Kansas City, Missouri, and he was going down a water slide, and the slide actually beheaded him, took his head, I think only partially off, but it killed him. And I was telling this to my neighbor, and the neighbor basically said, it's the parents' fault. The parents should have never let the kid go on the slide, and therefore that would never happen to me because I never let my kid go on a slide like that, and therefore it's the parents' fault. And I thought that was a really odd response, and what struck me about this person's response was I thought that it was a way of protecting him, or a way of trying to believe that this is not something that could happen to you or your kid. So think about this. You go to a water park, you and your kids ride the rides, and one of the rides is defective or unsafe, and your child ends up being killed. You want to believe that that could not happen to you, that your good judgment, that your good character, that your work ethic or whatever would protect you from these horrible things happening to you. And that's the impression I walked away with after that conversation with this person. And I've noticed this with a lot of people. They tend to blame the victim, or they tend to think that if something bad happens to someone, it's their fault. And then I was reading in the critical thinking literature that this actually has a name. It's called the just world fallacy. So not only did this make me feel, it made me feel justified that there's actually a name for this phenomenon I was observing, but it also made me feel less angry at the people who blame the victims, because apparently it is a universal human phenomena to have this belief that people who have bad things happen to them deserve it. So it's a natural way to think. I think it's a bad way to think. I can imagine those parents have their little kid killed on an outing that's supposed to be fun, and people blame the parents. It adds insult to injury. Okay, so the just world fallacy is the belief that in the real world, the good guys win and the bad guys lose. Of course, this happens in the movies, not all movies, but in a lot of movies, the good guys win and the bad guys lose. But the just world fallacy is that in the real world, if you're good, good things will happen to you. If you're bad, bad things will happen to you. It's the belief, the just world fallacy is that people who have horrible things happen to them somehow deserve it. And this is a pervasive cognitive bias that many people share. So it's not only that, good people have good things happen to them, but if something good happens to someone, people infer or tend to infer that they're good people. And if something bad happens to someone, people infer that they are a bad person. So back in 1980, this psychological researcher, M.J. Lerner, proposed that people need to believe in a just world, thus evidence that the world is not just as threatening, and people have a number of strategies for reducing those threats. So if something horrible happens, a way to make yourself feel less afraid is to think that the person deserved it. So if someone loses their job and they're out on the streets, it's a psychological way, M.J. Lerner says, it's a psychological defense mechanism to think, I'm a good worker, that would never happen to me. I have the power to prevent these bad things from happening to me. The bad things that happen to that person, it's because they didn't have the power to prevent them. Either they were morally bad, lazy, not a strong person. But in reality, a lot of times being a strong person, being a good moral person is not enough to protect you from horrible things that happen to you. And thus the just world fallacy. So another really common phenomena is to blame the victim. A lot of people think rape victims were asking for it. Or more subtly, you'll hear a story about someone who was raped and you think, I wouldn't have let that happen to me. Why? Because I'm smarter, stronger, faster. That would never have happened to me. So that's a more subtle way of blaming the victim. So in a series of psychological experiments, and there's a lot of research in the psychological literature on this phenomena, on people who believe in the just world fallacy. So this is a summary of the experiment. So apparently there was a woman who was an actress, and she was supposed to do some memory test, and if she didn't do well, she received these horrible electric shocks, and she'd pretend that they would really hurt her. She wasn't receiving electric shocks. She would just mess up on purpose and would pretend to get shocked. And when the participants in the experiments, they were supposed to watch this, when they were forced to just sit and watch her suffer and they're not able to do anything about it, they describe her as being ugly. They just put her down as a person. So the participants adjusted their opinions of the woman downward as if to convince themselves that her agony wasn't so indefensible because she wasn't really such an innocent victim. So they would say all sorts of bad things about her, even though she was just a random person in an experiment who would mess up on some test and she'd get an electric shock. So if the participants had to watch her get shocked, they would say bad things about her. So here's what Lerner says about this. The sight of an innocent person suffering without possibility of reward or compensation motivated people to devalue the attractiveness of the victim in order to bring about a more appropriate fit between her fate and character. And Lerner and Simmons, so Lerner, who set up this experiment, was motivated to set up the experiment because he noticed he was working in a mental hospital. And mental illness is something that you have, it's just genetic, so you don't have any control over whether it strikes you or not. So, for instance, schizophrenia, 1% of the population is schizophrenic. You either have schizophrenic genes or you don't. You get schizophrenia. It's not in your power to prevent it. So Lerner was working in the mental hospital, and he noticed the doctors and nurses devaluing the people and making fun of them about their appearance because they were living such horrible lives. They somehow had the psychological need to explain that the mentally ill people somehow deserved it. But obviously, especially schizophrenic people, do not deserve it. This is just something that happens to you when you're around 17 or 18 years old. You just slowly go crazy. People have talked about they're completely normal. They feel themselves going crazy. And there's really not much a person can do about it. There's some medications that help schizophrenia, but not completely. Interestingly enough, also, this has also happened with Holocaust memorials. So in 2009, there's a study by Imhoff that showed that people who visited Holocaust memorials walked away feeling like the victims deserved it. So there's, in some of the literature, there's an interesting debate about these Holocaust memorials that are meant to honor the Jews that died in the Holocaust are having the opposite effect of increasing anti-Semitism. So here, confronted with an atrocity that people otherwise can't explain, people become slightly more likely on average to believe that the victims brought it on themselves. So they see this horrible tragedy, and somehow your brains, we just can't make heads or tails of it. So you have the just world theory on one hand, and the theory that perfectly innocent people were rounded up and executed. And what do? Do you throw out the just world theory? Well, no, some people hold on to the just world theory and instead say these victims somehow deserved it or brought it on themselves. And this could be really subtle. It could be something like this, saying that, do I have a slide on this? Let me see. No. Saying something like, oh, the smart, hardworking Jews were able to get out before the Holocaust. So that's kind of a subtle way to say that, or not so subtle, to say that it was the Holocaust victims' fault. They were killed in the Holocaust. Of course, this is a philosophical proposition. You have two propositions in contention: the just world theory, so good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and innocent women and children were rounded up and killed. These two propositions are incompatible. You can't hold both of them at the same time. I think, and I think there's good reason to get rid of the just world fallacy and to keep the view that innocent men and women and children were rounded up and killed. Not to adjust this way, keep the just world fallacy and say they weren't innocent. Okay, so in the reading by McRaney, he mentions that religious people are more likely, authoritarian, conservative, and religious people are more likely to believe in the just world fallacy. But I'd like to say something quickly about how that at least Jewish and Christian religious teaching support the view that the just world is a fallacy. So there's a famous book in the Bible called Job. It is it's an important part of Jewish teaching. So Job had all these. Job was described as the most righteous person living. Job was a great person, and he had all these horrible things happening to him. So I guess all his animals died, his children died, he got the plague, he got all these painful boils all over his body, he had horrible things happen to him, he was in pain, and his friends came by, and his friends in this painting, all his friends are pointing at him saying, you must have done something to bring this on yourself. Bad things don't happen to good people. You must have done something bad, you need to repent, you need to figure out what you did wrong and fix it. And Job keeps saying, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm innocent. And they said, I don't believe you. And they kept accusing them. This goes on for chapter after chapter after chapter. Finally, at the end, God shows up and God rebukes Job's friends and says to them, hey, Job didn't do anything. Stop making him feel worse by blaming him. So God basically said, no, Job didn't do anything wrong. Job did not bring this suffering on himself. So that's one of my friends who's a scholar in Job says that he thinks this represents a turning point in Jewish teaching where the Jews realized that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. So someone who's lost it all, family, money, property, and their health, did not bring it on themselves. Okay, and then there's two Christian teachings about the just world fallacy. 13 and John 9. Oh, this one's John 9. John 9 and Luke 13. So Jesus is walking along and sees a blind man, and the disciples ask Jesus, why is this man this way? Why is he blind? Did his parents do something wrong, or did he do something wrong to make him this way? So the fault of this person being blind it's assumed that his parents did something to deserve it, or the man himself did something to deserve it. And Jesus answers, neither. The parents didn't do anything wrong, and the person didn't do anything wrong to bring this tragedy on himself, being blind. And here's another teaching at a different point in the Bible. Apparently a tower collapsed. The Tower of Siloam collapsed and killed a bunch of people, crushed a bunch of people underneath it. And the question is, what did these people do wrong to deserve being crushed? And the answer is, these people aren't any more guilty than the people who, than everybody else living in the city, is the answer. So this horrible tragedy happening to these people, it's a human tendency to think, hey, a building fell on you, you must have done something wrong. And Jesus answers, these people aren't any more guilty than anyone else walking around the streets. So, so there's reason here. So even in religious teaching, it says that the world is not necessarily just, meaning good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. So here's a summary. A lot of the time people who have bad things happen to them don't deserve it. Humans have a strong psychological need to believe that we can control the world and that bad things won't happen to them. And that's why my next door neighbor said, oh, I would never let my son go on that. So basically my good judgment will protect my son from having him be killed. And a lot of people think this. But I know a lot of people that have a very good judgment who've had their kids killed. At my first job, the school secretary's son was playing t-ball. He got hit in the head with a t-ball and died in his sleep that night. The school counselor's son got hit crossing the street. So these are things that can happen to even the best of parents. Blaming the victim is a way of protecting yourself, in that you blame the victim and you say, hey, I'm not going to be a victim because I'm smarter, stronger, or better than that. So it's a way of keeping you from feeling so vulnerable. And then the flip side is, if you believe this, though, and something bad happens to you, you might be looking for what you did to make it happen, but you didn't necessarily cause it to happen. Bad things that happen to you aren't always your fault. So a quick note, it's often worth it to ask that if any bad choices led to the position you're in, but oftentimes bad things happen that are not your fault. So so this is just a quick fallacy that I threw in here. It's a cognitive bias that is pervasive in humans, and it's one of my pet peeves. That when people, I had a student last semester, here's the other reason why I added this. So not just my next door neighbor, but I had a student last semester that said that all poor people are lazy. So his position was, if you're poor, it's your fault, which is, if you look at the whole world's population, not true on the whole at all.